Welcome to a journey you'll probably never forget.
Or depending on your tolerance for ancient history, you might just fall asleep halfway through, but don't worry.
If you doze off, Attila will still be there,
Standing right by your bed,
arms crossed.
smiling, with that same look that once made all of Europe tremble.
And he'll whisper, "Did you really think I was gone?"
In this episode, we're not just talking about Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God. We're talking about his shadow, a ghost that has slipped through the centuries, hiding in politics, in wars, in technology, and deep inside the modern human mind. From the endless steps where his horses once thundered to the sleek glass towers of today's Europe, his legacy still lingers. Silent, relentless, and,
A little terrifying. You're about to hear the story of a so-called barbarian.
who wasn't barbaric at all. A strategist who understood fear better than any general in history. An empire that supposedly collapsed, but never really died. It just kept living, in our language, in our symbols, and in the very way we define power. We're diving into 5 chapters. 5 memories of a ghost. From myth and fear, through tactics
And manipulation.
into the lost genius of forgotten innovation, and finally, into the modern world where Attila still whispers in the decisions of today's leaders. And by the time this video ends, you might realize Attila never disappeared. He just changed form.
Change names. And put on the crown of the 21st century. I'll grab a seat.
Pour yourself a coffee, or honestly grab a pillow, because things are about to get deep.
And if you can't sleep tonight, at least you'll know why. But before the ghost begins his story, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the legends history tried to bury, but we definitely won't. Maybe you've heard the name Attila.
Scourge of God. The man who made the Roman Empire tremble. The guy medieval priests prayed for and prayed against, hoping his soul would rest in peace and that he'd never come back. But here's the funny part. Most of what we know about Attila comes from his enemies. In other words, his story was written by the people who feared him most. And when the losers write history, well, things tend to get a little dramatic. It's the 5th century. Rome, once the unstoppable machine that conquered the world, is now more like a massive corporation on the edge of bankruptcy, still posting on social media like, "Don't worry guys, we're just restructuring our business model." The officials are corrupt, taxes are crushing, people are selling their household idols just to survive. And the borders? They're so long that even the guards have forgotten what they're guarding. And then, from the faraway steppes, where the wind blows harder than a Roman coin is worth, a man appears. His name is Attila. No palaces,
No marble walls.
no silk robes or golden crowns.
His royal court, leather tents. His throne, a block of wood, but don't let the rough look fool you.
Inside that man was a brain sharp enough to make all of Europe hold its breath. The Romans called him a barbarian.
Sounds nasty, right?
But in Latin, barber literally just meant someone who speaks funny. Kind of like how you feel listening to coders talk about debugging at a party. The thing is, Attila was smart enough to turn that mystery into a weapon. He made people fear him not just for his strength, but for the unknown. They didn't know what he'd do next. And that, my friends, was Attila's first strategic lesson. Fear comes from uncertainty. Attila wasn't just a conqueror. He was a master of what we'd now call controlled fear diplomacy. Instead of attacking Rome, he negotiated. Picture this. He walks into the Eastern Roman court, smiling, calm, polite, and says, "I won't invade if you send me a little gold as a sign of friendship." And that's how the Romans, the same empire that once ruled the world, ended up sending yearly tribute to a man with no palace and no walls. Today we'd call that geopolitical leverage.
Making your opponent do what you want while they still think they're doing it by choice.
Sound familiar?
Yeah. It's the same logic behind most modern peace treaties. Basically, you give me what I want and I won't crush you. What made Attila truly terrifying wasn't his army, it was his mind.
Long before the modern doctrine of shock and awe, Attila perfected it. He didn't just attack, he made his enemies believe an attack was coming. And that was often enough to make entire cities panic and surrender before his troops even arrived. That's called psychological warfare, using fear.
Rumors and emotion as your main weapon. And Attila?
He was the Mozart of that art form. Thousands of years ago, he made the world tremble with silence. Here's what's fascinating. Attila never built his empire out of stone.
No walls, no monuments.
No shiny inscriptions that said, Attila the Great was here. Because he knew. Everything fixed eventually falls. His empire had no borders.
It moved, it lived.
It breathed with the wind. If Rome was a fortress, the Huns were a storm. Untouchable. Everywhere and nowhere at once. Today, historians call him the father of mobile warfare, the idea that flexibility beats brute strength. And if you think that sounds modern, look at any 21st century rapid strike military doctrine. Attila was doing that in the 400s, just with horses instead of tanks. When he died, his empire collapsed almost overnight, but his influence never did. From the way medieval kingdoms built their armies, to how modern politicians use fear to control the masses. They're all echoes of the same Hunnic logic. You don't have to control everything.
You just have to make people believe you can. Attila didn't disappear, he just changed form.
Every empire collapses when its belief system runs out of power. That's not just history.
That's human nature.
When we left off, you already knew that Attila never really vanished. He just changed shape, changed names, and quietly stepped into our world. But before his ghost becomes modern, we need to go back to the night it all began to fall apart. The night when one man's death triggered the quietest disaster in history. When Attila died, Europe didn't believe it. Some Roman nobles threw parties, priests said prayers of joy, and the same men who once trembled at the sound of Hunnic hooves, they exhaled, like prisoners who just dodged a death sentence. But what no one realized was that Attila's death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a slow, systemic collapse. The Hunnic Empire had never been built on stone. It was built on fear, a structured, organized, regulated fear, one that only worked because someone powerful was holding the reins. When that person disappeared, the machine started eating itself. 3 days after his funeral, the allied tribes began arguing. Who would rule now? Who was strong enough to hold the golden treaties Attila had made with Rome? The answer, and it was no one. Attila's power, like every empire born from one extraordinary man,
Existed only because he did. His sons, Elek,
Dengizic, Ernak, fought like corporate heirs in an emergency board meeting after the CEO suddenly drops dead. The
once terrifying empire now looked like a company collapsing under its own
shareholders, each tribe pulled back to its own land. And the generals who had sworn loyalty to Attila, they vanished, would as if they'd never existed. Here's a hard truth about history. The strongest empires rarely fall from outside attack. They rot from the inside. It's what modern systems theorists call power entropy. The idea that every structure, if it's not fueled by a central energy source, eventually falls into chaos. Attila was that energy source. And the moment he was gone, the entire Hunnic structure began to decay. Like a machine losing power, the instant you pull the battery out. His empire ran on fear. And ironically, that same fear was what stopped anyone from replacing him. To the east, the Byzantine Empire, the same one that used to send Attila tribute in gold, cut all contact. They sealed their borders and announced, "We have no business with the Huns anymore." To the west,
Rome moved like a neighbor watching the house next door burn, sending troops to liberate the lands once under Hunnic control.
which of course meant take everything, but call it peacekeeping. Meanwhile, the tribes that once rode under Attila's banner, the Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, rebelled. They were done being cogs in a collapsing machine. Civil war broke out, lasted less than 2 years, and everything Attila had built in 2 decades turned to dust. The Battle of Nidau, 454 AD, that was the end of the Hunnic Empire, a battle where Attila's former warriors slaughtered each other under flags that used to unite them. Europe has seen many great wars, but few as tragic as this one, because this wasn't the fall of a kingdom, it was the suicide of an idea. From that moment on, the fear Attila once weaponized began to change shape. It was no longer the thunder of hooves. It became preventive policy. No longer the threat of invasion, but peace negotiations. In short, Europe learned from Attila and used his lessons systematically. From the 5th to the 7th century, an entire continent learned a new art, ruling through organized fear. Roman emperors learned to use rumors as weapons. Popes mastered the crowd's psyche through the promise of salvation. And the nobles, they learned Attila's most valuable lesson. True power doesn't come from strength. It comes from making others believe you're strong. If Attila had lived another century, he probably wouldn't have needed to fight anymore. He'd just open a school. The Art of Manipulating Power by Attila the Hun. Byzantines, Franks, Visigoths, they'd all enroll. And here's the irony. While Christian scholars wrote sermons calling him the Scourge of God, they were, without realizing it, learning from him. The church's hierarchy, its centralization of power, its control over emotion through symbols, all carried echoes of the Hunnic spirit, dressed up in holiness. But Attila left behind something even deeper, a psychological vacuum. Europeans now lived between 2 extremes, the fear of being conquered and the emptiness of having no one left to fear. His name became legend. For centuries, parents whispered, "If you misbehave, Attila will come back." He became a symbol, not because people admired him, but because they needed him. They needed a monster to blame for their own chaos. But here's the most fascinating part. Even though the empire collapsed, the people didn't disappear. They blended in, carrying with them Attila's customs,
Strategies and survival instincts. The Huns lived on through the Magyars,
the Bulgars, the Hungarians, each keeping a spark of the steppe alive as new empires rose, Carolingians, Byzantines, Ottomans. You could still feel it, a faint echo of the steppe wind, whispering through European politics and warfare. Thousands of years later, historians finally noticed something. What the Romans once called barbarism was actually a decentralized social system, fluid, efficient, optimized for survival, like a blockchain of the ancient world. Each tribe was an independent node, connected by loyalty and shared interest. Attila didn't need walls. He had speed. Didn't need laws, he had warrior honor. Didn't need propaganda. He had fear. And when later empires, Ottoman, Napoleonic, even modern states, learned to control information and emotion, they were just recycling an old blueprint, the Hunnic model. So no, Attila didn't die. He transformed from a nomadic king into a principle of power. From the thunder of hooves on the steppe to the whisper of politics in a modern boardroom, from primal fear to institutional fear. And when you look back, you can see the beautiful paradox of history. When Attila lived, he was the storm that tore Europe apart. When he died, he became the invisible foundation beneath it, a world where power runs on emotion, where peace is just another way to threaten, and where every time fear spreads, Attila's ghost smiles. Attila didn't disappear, he just changed form. Every empire collapses when belief runs out of power. When the Hunnic Empire collapsed, Europe thought it had escaped the nightmare, but, in truth, it had just learned how to recycle fear. Attila was no longer galloping across the plains. He was shaking hands in back rooms, smiling for the cameras, while tightening his grip behind the curtain. That ghost, the one that once made a continent tremble, now wears a suit, sits in conference rooms and wields treaties instead of swords. When Rome fell, Europe entered the Middle Ages, but a time without real kings, only rulers who governed through faith and fear. Sound familiar? That's the oldest political playbook humanity's ever written. Make people believe you're their savior while quietly holding the power to make them fear losing that salvation. It's poetic, really. What Attila once did with a blade, emperors and popes later did with prayers. The only difference was, instead of burning villages, they burned books. Instead of hanging enemies, they hung holy symbols. By the 12th century, Europe had invented something called modern politics. But don't let the branding fool you. It was still the same old game, control through emotion. The new kingdoms didn't need horses anymore. They had spies. They didn't need armies to invade. They had information, and information, that's the weapon Attila would have loved in the 21st century. One of the Huns' favorite tactics was simple. Strike the mind before you strike with steel. Today, we call that influence warfare, the art of breaking trust instead of walls,
of making people doubt themselves instead of killing them. Look around.
Politicians don't wear armor anymore, but they still know how to weaponize fear. We're protecting you from the enemy. Sound familiar? That's the opening line of every empire, from the Huns to the United States. Attila understood something the modern world still runs on. Fear makes people cooperate better than hope ever could. Fear doesn't need proof. It just needs repetition. By the 20th century, we gave it a new name, propaganda. But it's really just the same campfire storytelling the Huns used, only now with microphones and primetime news slots. Every time you hear a fiery speech, every time a leader says, "The enemy is out there," that's Attila, speaking through them, eloquent, polite, and funded by your tax dollars. Attila doesn't need to return in flesh. He lives in the systems we've built after him. Anywhere there's someone afraid of losing power, anywhere people trade freedom for comfort, he's there. Look at the modern world map. Alliances, unions, defense blocs, global corporations. You're staring at the Hunnic Empire 2.0 back then, tribes allied for survival. Now nations unite for trade deals and gas contracts. The difference? They fly jets instead of horses. But the logic's the same. Fear is still the glue that holds us together. Politicians today call it realpolitik, pragmatic politics. It's a 19th century word for a 5th century idea.
Realpolitik means, forget morality.
Focus on results. Or, as Attila might have put it, don't talk to me about peace. Unless you brought gold. These days, people don't pay in gold. They pay in data. Power no longer lives in tributes. It lives in information. And if you think modern power still depends on armies, try unplugging a nation's internet for 30 seconds. And watch Attila smile. Modern politics doesn't kill with swords. It kills with algorithms, with clicks. with the illusion that everything you fear was your own choice. Attila knew that game centuries ago. Whoever controls fear controls the world. We just changed the tools, from war horses to servers, from camps to social networks. If Attila were alive today,
He wouldn't invade Rome. He'd launch a global media company.
he'd call it Hunnic News Network. Slogan: "We terrify, you comply." And honestly, a few networks today are doing just fine at that. In the 21st century, power doesn't need to force you. It just needs to make you want to be forced. You willingly trade freedom for safety. You choose to believe in strong leaders so you don't have to think for yourself. That's Attila's true legacy. The Romans once sent him gold for peace. We send our personal data to tech companies for a little peace of mind. History doesn't repeat. It just updates the format. From real gold to digital gold, every time you scroll through social media, every outrage, every fear, every viral post, remember, it's refined fear, industrialized fear, measured, optimized, and distributed by AI. If Attila was the father of psychological warfare, then AI is his obedient child, running the family business one click at a time. In politics, fear isn't a tool. It's the currency. Every election, every campaign, every speech, it all revolves around one question: who can make the people fear less? No one promises a better future. They promise protection from the nightmare they created themselves. That's Attila's perfect circle. Create the problem, then sell the solution. Today, we call it policy. Attila called it survival by intelligence. The terrifying truth: the more civilized we become, the more sophisticated our violence gets. No one swings swords anymore, but millions die from hunger, war, or disinformation. No villages burn, but entire nations can be set on fire by a week of manipulated headlines. No one calls themselves the Scourge of God, because now every ruler smiles for the camera. The modern world doesn't need one Attila. It needs millions hidden inside each of us, each system, each algorithm, believing we're doing good as we spread fear to maintain order. And so history leaves us with one haunting question. What's scarier? A tyrant who rules with violence, or a system that convinces you violence is necessary? If Attila's watching from above, he's probably smiling.
Because he doesn't need to return.
He's already won, not with a sword, but by teaching the world to run on his principles. Because power never disappears. It only changes form, hiding beneath words like stability, security, peace. Three of the most comforting words in history, and the most dangerous lies we've ever believed. Attila didn't invent fear. He just showed us how to turn it into a machine. And we, the civilized ones, simply learned to run it more efficiently. So tonight, if you turn on the TV and hear a politician say, "We'll do everything to keep you safe," listen closely. Between the applause and the promises, you might just hear it, the faint thunder of hooves.
And in that echo, Attila smiles, not because he's back,
but because he never really left. Attila didn't disappear, he just changed form. Every empire collapses when belief runs out of power. When Attila fell, Europe exhaled. But it wasn't the breath of peace, it was the gasp of someone who'd just escaped a nightmare, only to wake into another dream, darker, deeper, and harder to escape. His death didn't end the story. It started a chain reaction, like tipping over that first domino and watching the rest collapse on their own. Attila's fall was that first piece, and the shockwave from it shook an entire continent. The 5th century, the Huns were gone. Rome was rotting from the inside out, and out of the wreckage of two giants, something new began to rise. A Europe without empires, but full of small ambitions trying to look like one. People thought, the tyrant is dead. We can finally breathe. But tyrants never really die, not as long as their ideas survive, and Attila's idea was still alive. The tribes that once followed him, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, scattered to the wind. But they didn't leave empty-handed. They carried a political model, a decentralized alliance of power. If you put it in today's terms, they zipped the Hun Empire into a single file and started unzipping it across Europe. In Italy, the Ostrogoths built a kingdom under Theodoric, a man who'd once fought under Attila's banner, now ruling with the same tactics. In Spain, the Visigoths learned to govern through speed and fear. In Gaul, the Franks figured out something simple. If you want to rule, make people fear you more than they fear your enemies. The Hun Empire was gone, but its political DNA spread like a virus. It didn't need borders. It only needed memory. When Rome fell, chaos filled the void. Law collapsed.
Trust disappeared.
And only fear remained. Fear of losing safety. Out of that fear, the church rose. The church didn't promise victory, it promised salvation. After centuries of running from Attila, people finally knelt, not to a conqueror, but to God, because they couldn't bear the thought of another Attila. One empire fell, another was born. The only difference, the weapon was now faith. Sounds divine, right? But look closer. The medieval church and Attila played by the same rulebook. Control through fear and symbols. Attila had his iron whip. The church had the cross. Attila threatened with fire and steel. The church threatened with hellfire. Both knew the same truth. People submit fastest to what they can't see. Don't let the castles fool you. Behind those thick stone walls, kings and lords ran the same old system. Loyalty traded for privilege. It was just the Hun clan model, rebranded. Each fief was its own little power node. Each vassal be both ally and threat. The center only held as long as the satellites stayed loyal. That wasn't European political philosophy. That was step-style blockchain, so when Machiavelli wrote The Prince centuries later, he wasn't inventing something new. He was just updating Attila's code. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. After Attila, Europe entered the Dark Ages, but it wasn't dark because the light was gone. It was dark because the light was controlled. Every new regime survived by inventing an enemy. Pagans, barbarians, witches, heretics, no enemy, make one. Because when fear fades, people start thinking. And when people think,
Power trembles. That was Attila's invisible empire. A dominion not of land,
but of perception. Before Attila, Europe was just a location. After him, it became an identity. To exist, you needed an other. And Attila, with all the East behind him, became that other. The Carolingians, the Franks, the Byzantines, all of them built around the same fear. If we fall apart, the Huns will return. Europe learned the lesson well. Fear unites faster than ideals. From the Crusades to the European Union, that logic never really left. We come together, not out of love, but out of survival. His death didn't just change politics. It rewired Western thought. The Greeks believed in reason. After Attila, Europe believed in control. Plato dreamed of a republic ruled by logic. Hobbes imagined a leviathan, a monster state governing through fear to prevent chaos. Foucault mapped invisible power, a web that makes people police themselves. 3,000 years. One message. Without Attila, we become our own. From the 14th to the 19th century, new empires rose: Spain, England, France, Austria, the Ottomans. Each one just another version of the Huns. Same loop: fear, order, prosperity, arrogance, collapse, a cycle without end, like dominoes reset, just to fall again. When Attila died, Europe thought it had slain the beast. But really, it had just learned to imitate him, more educated, better dressed, armed with constitutions. Every revolution since has been a remix of Attila's playbook. The French killed their king and got Napoleon. The Russians killed their Tsar and got Stalin. Monarchies fell, democracies rose, but fear stayed, smarter, quieter, more efficient. That's the domino chain of power. And Attila was the first to fall. One collapse, and history has been looping ever since.
More modern.
More legal, never less brutal, and yet from the rubble, Europe discovered its rarest treasure, self-awareness. After centuries of fear, people finally asked, why are we afraid? That question gave birth to the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern age. That was Attila's last domino, the one that fell upward. Because the same fear that once enslaved Europe eventually drove it to create philosophy, art, and science, as a way to fight its own shadow. And when the screen fades to black and the voice drops low, like the closing monologue of an HBO finale, it says, Attila's death didn't just reshape Europe. It rewired the human mind. It taught us that all power begins in fear. But once fear is seen clearly, it turns into knowledge. Europe turned its nightmare into a lesson. And while the world still spins on the same domino chain of power, somewhere, beyond time and empire, Attila still stands at the head of the line, watching the pieces fall
And smiling. Attila never vanished. He just changed form. Every empire falls the moment belief runs out of battery.
When Attila died, people thought he'd left history behind.
But maybe
He just switched servers from dusty steppes to digital clouds, from iron horses to data centers, from the whip to the algorithm. The fear that once made Europe tremble doesn't ride on horseback anymore. It runs on data. It hides inside glowing screens, endless feeds, and every choice you think you're making. Attila never really disappeared. He just got an upgrade. Attila 2.0, the algorithmic emperor. Back then, Attila ruled through fear. Now fear rules us. We don't need tyrants anymore. We have machine learning. Sleepless lines of code read every click, every pause, every heartbeat, and use that data to steer us through emotion, not reason. Attila once said, "You don't need to control everyone. Only make them believe you can." Tech platforms, Google, Facebook, TikTok, took that quote and turned it into a global system. If Attila ruled with a whip, today's power rules with suggestions. A headline, a red notification bubble.
one tap, and suddenly you're marching in an invisible army. Fear doesn't come from war anymore.
It comes from being left out, left behind, unfollowed, cancelled, disconnected. That's the new cavalry charge. The modern world finished what Attila started. It weaponized emotion. Swords became data.
Armies became algorithms.
Instead of burning villages, we burn reputations. The battlefield is psychological now, and each of us is our own little tribe, fed by belief, tracked by engagement. Sounds cutting edge, right? It's not. It's the same old Hunnic strategy, divide and conquer through fear. The 21st century doesn't need an Attila because everyone's their own Attila now. We manipulate others through what they fear and call it telling the truth. Technology gives us a kind of power kings could only dream about. We can wage wars, destroy reputations, even collapse markets with a single share button. One hashtag can topple a government. That's the Hunnic Empire over Wi-Fi. No arrows, just bandwidth. Philosophers used to say power was an invisible beast. Now that beast has a user interface. We talk to it every day. What's on your mind? Want to keep watching?
Innocent questions, worries that are really summons.
And every click you make builds another brick in the digital empire Attila would have admired. Today's power structure has 3 layers. Data, the new gold. The tribute we hand over voluntarily. Algorithm, the generals of the new empire. Illusion of choice. The religion of the 21st century. Every click, every scroll, every like is harvested, filtered and mapped. A psychological map of humanity. If Attila had that, he wouldn't have needed an army. Just a spreadsheet. Here's the irony. We turned fear into an operating system. Fake news, markets, politics, your everyday life, all engineered to keep you anxious but never disconnected. Fear doesn't kill anymore. It feeds the system. The more we fear, the more we engage. The more we engage, the more control we surrender. It's a perfect loop.
A doom scroll empire. If Attila was the storm, then today's world is the atmosphere he left behind.
From him, we learned how to organize fear, and we used it to build religion, politics, social media, and now artificial intelligence. The form changed. The formula didn't. Control through emotion. Today, fear doesn't come from the battlefield.
It comes from the phone in your hand. It doesn't shout.
It doesn't threaten. It just suggests.
And you follow. No whip, no king, no Attila.
We live in a post-Hunnic world where the ghost of Attila isn't a metaphor anymore. It's the background process running inside every platform, every government, every thought. No one orders you to be afraid, but you are. No one forces your choices, but they're already chosen. That's Attila's final victory. He doesn't need to return. We've become his empire, a global network powered by fear and digital faith. Thousands of years ago, people feared Attila to survive. Today, we fear to feel alive. And yet, somewhere in the static and the scrolling, there's still a faint human echo. Small, real. Like the wind that once swept the steppes. The only question is, do we still have the courage to listen to it when the machines are speaking louder than we ever could? And if one night you can't sleep, the blue light flickers across your face and you feel like someone's watching you from inside the screen. Don't worry, it's not an ad.
It's not a glitch. It's just Attila smiling because he knows
you're still afraid. Every empire still lives as if fear still breathes.